Thank you for spending time and taking part of the afternoon to hear me out. I'm very grateful for that, and thank you, Superintendent, for giving me the opportunity. Now, this presentation isn't specifically made for Attica, but it's something that I'm going to do later on this tour. And what you will see is, well, mostly about Halden, but the Nordic countries are quite similar. So when I come into core values and goals for the correctional service, I guess a warden from Sweden, Finland, Denmark could probably say the same. So have a wider perspective than Halden Prison when I speak, especially on that level, talking about goals, etc. But of course, there will also be a number of things concerning Halden in detail also. Okay. Probably take 45 to 50 minutes, not sure, haven't done this before, so this is the first time for this presentation. But this is the facility then, Halden Prison. I'm not going to use time talking about too much figures and numbers, but as Jim said, built and completed in 2010, close to 260 inmates, and that's a small prison by US standards, a big prison in Norway, second largest in Norway, by the way. We have 47 prisons in total and a total of 4,000 inmates. That's the total population. We have an incarceration rate about 1/10 of the United States. As you can see, a lot of the terrain are kept within the prison. I'll come back to that later on. But let's start with some history. Now it should work. Late 80s, early 90s. Now I wasn't working in the corrections at that time, so this is based on history that I've got from other more experienced colleagues. So I can't elaborate on very much on it, but it's just to give you the background really. In Norway we also have prisons built, you know, the Philadelphia model from the 1850s, around there. We have that in Norway, you know, this central guard office with wings for the inmates out from the main guard office. But already 20-30 years after they went into operation, and Norway found out that that didn't work. Keep people in isolation with water and bread and their Bible, so to speak, didn't work. Recidivism didn't go down. So they thought already in the 1880s, 1890s that we have to do something differently. But what? Well, that took some time then. But they figured out already then that isolation is not the way to treat people if you're interested in a what works philosophy. But we have to make a jump into the late 80s and early 90s. Sorry if the text is a bit small, but that's how it is. A huge drug problem, high recidivism, psychiatric problems already then, also today of course. Riots, not anything like what you unfortunately have had here in Attica in the 70s, but still, by a Norwegian standard, we had riots. 2 tragic murders, 89 and 92. I remember those cases actually. It was, of course, a big issue in Norway, such tragic happenings. And limited interactions between officers and inmates. So this was the situation. Okay, something had to be done. The government then made what we call a white paper, which went through the parliament, which really made a shift in how the correctional services operate in Norway. You could, in a way, go in 2 directions, or you could actually 3 directions. You could just move on as we did, that's always an option, or you can go in some other direction. I guess being, in lack of a better word, I said tough on crime, maybe that would be the natural way when you have drugs, riots, murders. Of course, that would probably be the most natural way to go. But there was now another option also, to have a more humane approach towards the inmates. And Norway chose that one actually. Maybe surprisingly, but that's what the politicians did. Now this made some changes in the correctional services. On a systemic level, there were some new core values a new way of organizing the corrections service, but more importantly, on the individual level. The role of being a correctional officer changed. And you had some new tools like a future plan. I will get into that later on, what that means. And by the way, questions, feel free to ask any questions through my presentation or take them afterwards. That's up to you. So this new role then for the correctional officer, from guard to also be a social worker. So it's a kind of duality in the future role of the correctional officer, and he should contribute to helping the inmates to live a life without crime. So the role changed quite a lot. The more practical consequences. The officers had to be able to sit down and discuss with the inmates, discuss what their previous life have been, what measures should be relevant for you or the inmate to change his life. So we had to go into specific discussions and communication with the inmates regarding these issues. The officer must be able to plan and monitor the execution of sentences, meaning, well, if I mention the future plan again, which every inmate should have, gives the long-term goals. You break it down. What does it have to do to reach your 5-year goal? What do you have to do next year, next month, next week, tomorrow? And that's the role of the officer, to monitor that and to motivate the inmate. So of course, to be able to do that, the officers needed to know about the opportunities that exist throughout the correctional services in Norway. So from being a safety and security provider, he was, as I said, a kind of social worker also. And that accounts for every correctional officer. Our officers are very kind of generic. They all know the same, and they rotate within the facility, at least in Halden Prison. So being a correctional officer in Norway then, what does it mean? Well, of course, the security part is the foundation. It's of course the most important part, still is, no doubt about it. The guard duty, searching, conflict resolution as a couple of examples. But in this white paper then, the new role was described. It wasn't called contact officer at that particular time, but the content was the same. We just changed the name later on. Meaning that every officer have 2 or 3 inmates that he is the primary contact for. So every inmate then have a primary contact officer and a secondary. And that's the role of the contact officer, is to connect the inmate with any third parties necessary to plan for his future. It should be a role model, a motivator, a communication and a dialogue partner, so to speak. So we're emphasizing this role extremely high. Difficult to combine with the security role, it can be, but it is necessary. And it's being done that in all prisons in Norway then. And also, we do have civilians participating also in the gymnasium, etc., activating the inmates, but also the officers participate in that part, both organizing and actually participate. So you can go to Halden Prison and see an officer playing football with the inmates, playing basketball, whatever. And with some further training, the officers can also be what we call a cognitive program instructor. We have programs. Well, when you talk about programs, you're thinking about school work. That could be a wide variety of activities. And when we talk about programs, that's stress management, anger management, substance abuse programs, parenting skills, etc. Based on cognition, not on feelings, etc. So that's why it's being run by the officers. So that's the role of being a corrections officer in Norway. Quite a complex role, actually. And to be able to fulfill that role, being an officer in Norway is a 2-year full-time college education. 2-year. And the subjects, the most important subjects like ethics, psychology, criminology, and human rights, they are also, of course, trained in self-defense, how to act like a team if something happens, etc. But the subjects, well, these are examples of the detailed subjects. There are some areas, in a way, the education is structured in some areas. And the area that's called safety, the most important subjects within the area of safety, that's actually ethics. So that's an alternative way into what safety is all about, in a way. And I will talk about that later on. Well, it didn't stop there. A new white paper came in 2008, 2009. Went through Parliament almost unanimously. So all parties, with one small detail. We had this, what would that be in English? This electronic device that you have on your leg, right? Okay, yeah. The right-wing party in Norway, right-wing in Norwegian standards, would still probably be liberal by US standards, but still, they didn't like the concept. But beyond that, everything in this white paper were unanimously across all parties. And they stated a kind of a vision, punishment that works, which we have taken in Halden Prison also, lesser crime and safer society. And the focus in that white paper was the reintegration process, how to return to society, and also cooperation between the authorities. We are organized in a different way in Norway and than the United States. You have your own teachers, your own nurses. We don't do that in Norway. We have an import model, and I will go through it later on. But that gave the necessity to have a close cooperation between different agencies. So it's not necessarily the correctional services who owns the inmates. All the agencies being involved in a way has their responsibility and owns a part of the inmate also. And I will also come back to that, why I use the word own the inmate. Some principles then for the service, a couple of them. Having a humanistic approach to people and the principle of normality. And as Jim said, the duality between the safety of society, which of course we don't compromise on that in Norway either, but still this is equally important, the rehabilitation and the reintegration process into society. Because in Norway, everybody is going out someday. Almost the same also in the United States, I understand. Approximately 95% I've heard at some point will return to society. In Norway, the sentences are shorter and they return to society at a much earlier stage. Longest sentence in Norway is 21 years. And based on your behavior, what you've done, etc., around 50% of the inmates are being released after 2/3 of their sentence. Okay, let's go into these two principles and what do they mean? From a political point of view, let's start there. The punishment in Norway is the restriction of liberty. And that's what it is. It stops there, it ends there. Meaning that the inmate has not lost any other rights as a citizen in Norway. Meaning, for instance, he votes when there is an election, unlike, I believe, a lot of states in the United States. In Norway, you have a right to education up to the level of high school or vocational training, depending on what direction you would like to go into. That's a right you have. You have the same right in prison. It doesn't lose that right, and so on and so forth. So you lose your freedom, and that's all you lose. This is also part of the kind of humane approach, to use that word, that no one should serve under stricter circumstances than necessary to protect the society. So it doesn't matter what you've done. We are just going to assure that you are kept where you are supposed to be, so to speak. So there's not an extra punishment for having done this instead of that. We are just going to keep you inside. And regarding normality, that life in prison should resemble life in the outside community as much as possible. Now that has its limitations. We are talking about a prison with all the safety and security measures in place, but still, to avoid institutionalization as much as possible, we try to keep it as normal as possible. If you transfer the same principles down to Halden Prison and the architecture, I'll just give a couple of examples. It's a long list, but just a couple of them. Of course, a miniature society. You will find, like here, a local shop, a small church, a mosque, or a combined room actually being used by all religions. Library, well, you know, all the functions that you probably also have. You will find a small society also in a prison with 260 inmates. Separate buildings, everyday movement, part of the normality. Now, when I'm back home, I get up in the morning, take a shower, have breakfast, and then I leave home and go to work, a different place. And if I need to go to the doctor, I leave my workplace and travel to the doctor or the dentist or whatever. Now that kind of everyday movement we've tried to copy inside the prison. From an operational point of view, it would be both easier and cheaper to have everything in one big building. They lived on the bottom level, they worked on level 2 and whatever. Easy from a logistical point of view, cheap to operate, but would it be normal? We don't think so. Access to daylight, something I guess we don't think much about, but for an inmate, being deprived of his freedom, just the access to daylight to see how the day shifts is actually important. Many inmates have described being in a prison, depending on the prison and the facilities. It's like you are in a diving bell. You may lose the control of the day and time in a way. So we think that daylight is important. As you can see here, then in Halden, is a unit B and C where they live. They work down here at the activity center, a huge activity center. Visits and health department are here. So just to show you that you travel around the facility based on what you're doing, as I am in my life. The architect called Halden an iron fist in a silk glove, meaning that we have all the safety and security measures that we need in place, but we try to lower the feeling of being in a prison as much as possible. Okay. The principle of normality, and I will give you some pictures now from Norway, from the United States. Not my intention to provoke in any way, but it's just to see that it can be done differently, okay? I'm not saying that one thing is more right than another, just giving a few pictures and examples. This is Halden Prison. The living units for the inmates are normally consisting of 10 cells. We're a joint living room. This is the living room. Very nice, but it's brand new, 2010. Is it extravagant? Normal standard in Norway. So that's what we think normality is about. And well, if you think this is too nice, one can ask, is this more normal? I'm not going into that discussion, but this is a cell in Halden Prison, 10 square meters, private toilet and shower. I can remember when we opened, we had a visit from the county hospital and some psychiatrists, and then they thought, well, having a door into the bathroom, well, that is an excellent way of killing yourself. of course, and it is. And unfortunately, suicides have happened in Halden during the first 2 years. We have had 2 suicides up to 2012, and after that, none. So we keep getting better. But the point is, our staff knows the inmate. They interact so closely that we pick up the signals if anyone have trouble. So having like a cell where you can, unfortunately, hang yourself if you want to, that hasn't caused any practical problems or issues actually. And we think that because the staff knows the inmates. No bars in Halden. From every cell you see out to the trees, to the nature. And I will come back to the nature, why that's important actually. So again, what's normal? That's just a picture from a yard somewhere in the States. This is the yard in Halden Prison, actually. This is the yard. Why can't a yard look like this? Oh, it's dangerous, some of the officers said when we opened. What if the inmates climb up the trees? Well, we said, let them climb up. When they're tired, they'll come down again. There's nowhere to go. So, and no one has done it so far, but this is actually a yard in Halden Prison, and they all are alike. This is normality in our perspective. I have access to nature when I go home. Most people in Norway have. Why shouldn't inmates have? Now regarding nature, and I said, why is that important? Well, I went to the internet. Huffington Post stated that green spaces in school improve children's memory and attention. The University of Exeter in the United Kingdom had this research saying that green spaces deliver lasting mental health benefits, and we know what the inmate population deal with regarding mental problems. Now, if this can ease some of the minor problems, why shouldn't they have access to nature? Scientific report. It's impossible for you to read, but it says something like, suggests that people who live in neighborhoods with higher density of trees on their streets report significantly higher health perception and significantly less cardiometabolic conditions, etc. CBC News from Canada, green space improves mental health. So that's one of the reasons that we also have kind of nature inside the prisons. So based on what I've said so far, you must think that, is it possible? Oh, Jim knows it is possible, he's been there. But it's still a maximum security prison. So just a quick run through on what it means to be in a maximum security prison in Norway. You can have 60 minutes of visit per week. That's what you're entitled to. If we have the capacity, you can have the visits longer. If you have small children, you can apply for 30 more minutes, bring a total up to 90 minutes per week. That's it. You can call, and of course, we approve the visitors, and we decide whether you should have a glass wall or not. But that's in just very few cases. I guess 98% of the cases, the visitors and the inmate are in the same room, private. We don't have visiting halls in Norway. We have visiting rooms and privacy. So the inmate are together with his wife or his children or whatever in privacy, except from the rooms that we use for children. There we have a window. But privacy is kind of highly regarded, so to speak, in Norway. So that's why we have and personal integrity, etc. So that's why we have individual rooms. 20 minutes of telephone call per week, and we monitor every call. That's what you're entitled to. You have to speak in a language that the officer understands. So if you speak, whether if you're from Somalia and only speak Somali, you might not be able to call home. And people have said that, well, it must be a hotel coming from less developed countries to Halden Prison. Well, it is regarding the facilities, but based on what it means to be in a high security prison in Norway, maybe you're not able to call home. you'll never have visits because it's too far from your home country. So the inmates coming from countries far away are quite isolated, so to speak, and have a tougher time in prisons actually than many Norwegians. Your letters are being controlled, of course, like here. Private effects are being controlled, and it's limited what you can have to yourselves. Searches, metal detectors in and out of every building. Of course, drug testing. You're being escorted everywhere on the facility. Camera surveillance, listening devices. Well, the whole package. And in a way, I put this also, the number of officers in Halden Prison, which we think, of course, is something great, but it increases the risk of being institutionalized. That happens also in a prison like Halden. I spoke to a couple of former inmates 2 weeks ago that are now in a low security prison in the Oslofjord called Bostøy. Look it up on the YouTube and you will have another shock, but look it up, very interesting. Excellent results regarding recidivism. They talked about this. And the most difficult thing going from Halden prison to a low security was that at the low security prison you have to move around yourself, so to speak. So when you come to this low security prison, you take your bag and you're just told, okay, you can go to that house. And we have had inmates that can't cope with that because they have been followed by an officer in and out of every building for a couple of years, 4 or 5 years. It does something actually with you, also in a prison like this. So we try to minimize this, but it happens also in our prison. Now the inmate, who is he? It's a vast variety. It could be everything from the guy who you need to learn to take a shower and put on some clothes and eat or make a decent meal, up to PhD students, which we've also had. So there's a vast variety. But if you go to the statistics then, this is the picture. This is a 10-year-old survey, and these figures are based on what the inmate themselves report as challenges in life. Not based on screening tools, etc., but self-reporting. And of course this accumulates to far beyond 100%, and that's because if you have issues in life, they tend to accumulate. So an enormous rate of unemployment, health problems, 60% say I'm a substance abuser. Having children is of course not a problem, but it complicates life when you have these issues also. A lot of them have had problems in upbringing. I tend to say that the best correctional services would be to strengthen the children welfare services in a way. Prevention instead of detection and repair. But if you look at this figure, 30% said that I have some kind of mental disorder or issue. Now in 2014, there was a research project from the health region in the Eastern Europe, Eastern Norway, sorry. And they used screening tools and test kind of batteries, or what you call it, within the psychiatric community. And they found that 90%, not 30, but 90% of the inmates had some element of mental disorder. Now this covered the whole spectrum, from anxiety and depression, ADHD, personality disorders, autism spectrum disorders like Asperger, etc. So that was the whole map, so to speak. But 90%, a huge number. So they have issues in life far beyond the general population. In the Nordic countries, we think that you have to deal with this during the time in prison. If you don't, the recidivism rate will probably stay high. So we have to work on all these issues. This doesn't in any way excuse the inmate for what he has done. I believe that every human being is responsible for what is done, but it may be an explanation. So let's work on these issues to avoid same problems in the future. So that's why we in Norway have something that we call, well, a resettlement strategy, so to speak. Meaning that we are going to work with this substance abuse, educational situation, social network, victim, if the victim is interested, work or any other financial aid, debt counseling and housing. All of this. It doesn't help if you provide him with sufficient housing and is given an education if you don't deal with this substance abuse problem. So you have to deal with every issue that he has. Now, we can't do this alone in Norway. I said we have an import model, meaning that those providing these services in the outside community also provide the services in the prison. So I just put in here that for Halden prisons, or Halden prison, that well, educational services is the county who provides. As it is in the local community, it's the county. So in Halden prison, we have all these employers present. Around 50 people are working for different employers than the correctional services on a full-time basis. Now, why do we have this import model? Well, there are several reasons, a couple of them. And they are in a way connected to the normality principle. Better continuity. Like if you're a substance abuser, you have your psychologist inside prison from the county hospital, and when you are released, you have a smooth transition, maybe to the same treater or his colleague in the county hospital. Also regarding education, which is the local high school, so to speak, who provides the services in Halden prison, you can smoothly transfer to the high school in the local community. So it makes it smoother. And again, from a normality, better cross connections, I just spoke about that. And the financial side, we are not paying for this, since the inmates doesn't lose any rights as a citizen in Norway, meaning that the agencies are themselves paying for the services that they provide in prison. So the correctional services doesn't pay any money for this, actually. And it's also bringing the outside world into the prison. Prisons has for many years been not that open to the public, so to speak. And bringing in outside suppliers of services reduces the kind of, I don't know how to put it, but it opens up in a way, the prisons. Yes, please.
Are residents of Norway, the entire country, eligible to go to your prison that you're describing? Or are they geographically limited based on the location of the prison?
We have also a principle of in Norway that you should serve a sentence as close to your hometown as possible, and that is to maintain your network, etc. But you may be sent to different prisons, but that's a principle that you should serve a sentence as close to your hometown as possible. But in principle, you should have the same options whichever prison you are in, actually. Hard to provide the variety of services in a small prison, it is, but in principle, you have access to the same services throughout the country. Now, from an efficiency point of view, Halden prison is built to being good at reintegration work. However, we are placed at the border, so meaning that we have a number of pre-trial inmates from foreign countries which can't really utilize all the possibilities that we have in the prison. So from a cost-benefit point of view, I would like to see the inmate population a little bit different, but that's nothing that we can have any effect on actually. When I say pre-trial, in Norway we don't have prisons and jails. We just have one facility where both convicted and pre-trial inmates are in the same facility.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Services that are provided by the education system in the area or the healthcare system in the area, do the employees realize, by virtue of the fact that they're working close to a prison, that they're going to be expected to also provide those services in the prison? The school teacher in the town of Halden, does he or she realize they're going to be expected to teach classes in the prison?
They know that one, but most of them apply for a position in the prison. But they are always know about that, yes, and yes, they do. And another consequence of that is, if you take a high school diploma then in the prison, the diploma will be issued by the high school in the local community, not by the prison. So you won't have a diploma saying Halden Maximum Security Prison. It will say Halden High School. So that's also one of the consequences by bringing the services into the prison. Now, why treat inmates humane then, which we think we do in Norway? This slide I have because it's relevant for my presentation next week. You have more the principal one, the human rights perspective, which we value very high in the Nordic countries. So in a way you could end the discussion there, human rights really. But okay, if you in a way forget that principle, I think there are two pragmatic ones also why we should treat inmates in a humane manner. Because as we say, we are releasing a future neighbor. And in Norway, he can be your neighbor quicker than you may believe. And again, what kind of neighbor do you want? He might end up in my neighborhood. He might end up in your neighborhood. Do you want an inmate that we have tried to rehabilitate? We have dealt with his substance abuse problem. We've given him an education so that he can have an honest work. We provide him with housing, whatever. That's one kind of neighbor. Or you can have one neighbor that's been treated harshly, negatively, who leaves prisons with aggression and feeling of being mistreated. That's another neighbor you can have. Which neighbor do you want really? And we have what works kind of attitude. I normally say that it doesn't matter if you like Halden Prison or not. What's interesting is, does it work? Do we provide a safer society by working in this way? We think so, but I would be open to other approaches if other approaches works better. And the final one, the health and safety concerns for the staff actually working in prison. I will say a little bit about that also. Yeah, again a couple of pictures. These situations are not similar, of course, but you won't find this in a Norwegian prison. This is from the living unit in Norway, where they make their own food, socialize. Security, to go to another subject. Of course, it's vital. We think security in 3 dimensions in the Nordic countries. Of course, the static security part, the walls, the wire, those prisons having that, guns like here. I mean, that's the physical kind of what you can see. So the security glass, the wall, the wire, etc. That's a static security. Then you have the organizational security. Well, that's your contingency plans, your training of your staff, and so on and so forth. And finally, what we have in the Nordic countries is what we call dynamic security. This is the most important part when we think security, from our perspective. And you can probably understand from the picture what it's all about. It's not rocket science. It's actually the dialogue and communication between the correctional officers and the inmates. We want them to have a communication that's based on a humanistic approach, based on trust, based on respect, or not based on trust, but where you build trust. Yes, please.
How many officers do you employ?
In Halden? 170. And we have a total workforce of 290. So we have 120 other, can for example be social counselors, administration, officers working in the workshops, etc. But 170 correctional officers. You can look at inmates in two ways to make it, in a way, to simplify it. You can look at him as a criminal or a person who has done something criminal. Now that's the difference. If you look at him as a person who has done something criminal, you can still totally, how should I put it? Well, his actions are unacceptable, no doubt about it. But you acknowledge that the person is more than his criminal actions. Now, if you have that, if you look at people in that way, then you have the basis for treating people with respect. And if I've had a couple of correctional officers from Halden now here, they could tell a little bit about how is it to work in Halden Prison. Do I feel safe when being together with inmates? Do I feel threatened? No, they don't. So it gives some results. When the inmates are treated respectfully, they mostly treat you respectfully back. I mean, if I'm treated in a bad way, how will I reflect that back to the person? Of course, I'm being affected by it. I am. Why shouldn't the inmates be the same? And also this prevention versus detection. Now, if we had the guards being, or the officers being more distant, looking at the inmates, we could, of course, detect when anything happens. But having officers together with the inmates, talking with the inmates at any time, it's much more easy to prevent things from ever happening because we pick up the signals at a much, much earlier stage. So if you went to Halden Prison, you would see that it's very, very quiet because it's a very controlled situation, and a lot of it is based on the dynamic security way of working. So we think that it gives great results actually. Increases security on a systemic level, increases security on a personal level. I mean, if you have an inmate with an aggression issue and he sees two officers in front of him, one that he has a normal dialogue with, who shows him respect, and you have another officer, he doesn't know him, treat him harshly, negatively. If he's going to do something unacceptable, now which officer do you think he will go for? So we think that building a personal, not a private interaction, but a personal relations increases the security for the officers. And it creates a platform for the joint future planning, etc., which is a necessity in Norway. So thinking security in Norway is very much about that, even though we have walls, we have security glass, etc. But this is the most important part, actually. Yeah, I'll come back to that, to have an impact also on the correctional officers. So again, a couple of pictures just to show you different realities. This is Halden Prison, one example. This is somewhere in the States. Also Halden Prison from the library. Inmates in dialogue and in interaction with inmates. I don't know these guys, but I think these women have a better working environment and a safer working environment. Probably. It's a speculation, but at least that's our approach. There was an article in the New York Times last year, I think, yes, 2015, in the Saturday magazine. There was a researcher at the academy in Norway who stated that, and I have to read it again, I think. Guards are taught that treating inmates humanely is something they should do not for the inmates but for themselves. Well, for the inmates also, I would say. But the theory is that the theory is that if officers are taught to be harsh, domineering, and suspicious, it will ripple outwards in their life, affecting the self-image, their family, etc. Could that be true? Well, again, I went to the internet just to look it up. Could that be true? Newsweek, stating that prison officers need help, but they won't ask for it. In constant state of fight or flight, suffer high rates of mental health problems. I have no clue about the situation in Attica or any other specific prison, but these are more statistical facts that's being provided, which I've found. The Guardian, an English newspaper, talking about the PTSD crisis in America's jails. This is a research from 2011, I think, yes. She found that 34% of correctional officers suffer from PTSD. I thought that was an extremely high number, but that was her results, compares to 14% of military veterans. I'm sure you can argue the specific numbers, but it says something about that it is stressful to be a correctional officer. Undoubtedly. A blog from the American Military University stating that our correctional officers are killing themselves. Suicide rate twice as police officers. The Denver Post, prison horror, haunt guards' private lives. You treat other people like you treat convicts. Florida State had in 2012 a study regarding correctional officers and domestic violence in Florida, which found that there was a higher number of domestic violence among officers than the average population. So we think then, from a Norwegian perspective, that if being a correctional officer was based on something like dynamic security, if you relate to an inmate in that manner, you increase your own safety at work, you reduce your stress level, and you have a better working environment. That's what we think. Now, going back to Halden Prison again. We should be a complete provider of knowledge and opportunities, it's said to be. It will take far too much time to just run through all of this, but I will give you some examples. We have a mapping and assessment system in Norway. I guess you have them in most countries. I think we have a little bit different approach than most other countries, because what we are screening the inmates when they come to prison is not what kind of risk they represent in prison, not what we estimate about their recidivism. We focus on their needs and their resources. So what resources do they have that we can build on, and what are their needs in life? That's how we screen inmates in Norway. Extensive use of the personal contact officer role. We use motivational interviewing as a communication technique for change, etc. So all officers are trained in this technique. A lot of cognitive programs. The future plan, very important tool to have a structure and a direction in life for the inmate and have both long-term and short-term goals, and to continuously measure that they reach the goals. We have a vast variety of work options and educational options at all levels, drug abuse teams, and so on and so forth. Also in Halden Prison, like any other maximum security prison in Norway, you have to progress through the system, so to speak. if you are being released directly from Halden Prison, that's not the inmates that we've succeeded with, so to speak. You need to progress gradually through the system. You need to gradually have your freedom back, because life in prison, as you know, and also in Halden Prison, is very much unlike the community outside. Even though we try to lower the feeling of being in prison, even though we have the principle of normality, you should not be released directly from Halden Prison or any other maximum security prison if you think recidivism and the risk of recidivism. You need to progress. You need to be given trust gradually. You gradually need to be used to freedom. More and more options are given to you. So we want them to transfer from a maximum security prison like Halden to a low security prison or a halfway house, not being released directly. I will not go into detail about the sentence progression in Norway, just mention that it is important. We try to motivate and have everyone to progress. But I will mention one concept which is a part of the progression, and that is leave. In Norway you get leave. I don't know if you're at all familiar with the concept, meaning that you can leave the prison first for a couple of hours, then for more hours, and then for an overnight stay. Also from a maximum security prison. So even though if you're a murderer or a rapist or whatever, we will try to have a sentence progression. We will give you leave when we find it secure enough. You start with 2-3 hours with a couple of officers dressed in civilian, go down to the local mall, have a cup of coffee, just to feel the tempo in society, which is much higher than in a prison, where things are quite slow, and the noises, the different noises in society than in a prison. And you might think, is that a big deal? Yes, it is. I've had people killing 3 persons who wanted to abort their first supervised leave. They couldn't really cope with it. They've been too many years in a maximum security prison. So you need to start in a gentle manner. Supervised first, then 3 hours together with the family. We should of course know who picks you up and who leaves you back. You will of course be tested when you come back, and etc. You will have to report to the police during your leave, and so on and so forth. And you gradually build trust, and your leave will be longer and longer and longer until you reach overnight stay, even though you're in a maximum security prison. And you might think, wow, does it work? Is it really possible? Do they come back? That's a good question. Yeah, I talked about that already. These figures are for 2013, but they don't vary much. Over 33,000 leaves from both maximum and medium security prisons and low security. 58 did not come back. Meaning that 99.93% of the inmates came back in time. Now, some of them may have taken a beer. Some of them we might find out after a couple of days that they smoked cannabis or whatever, but they come back. And the few that don't, well, the police will find them at some stage. So you might think this is a high-risk sport, giving them leave, but they know they're building trust. If they misuse the trust, okay, then you're back to square one or whatever you call it again, and you have to start building trust again. So that's why they're taking care of this option so much, really. We show them trust, and they use it in a good manner. Now, the way that we treat inmates in Norway and in the Nordic countries as a whole, then, does it work? Well, these first 3 are from Halden Prison. A low level of aggression and physical violence among inmates. The worst thing that has happened is at the woodwork workshop, so to speak, where an inmate took a a piece of timber and smacked another inmate in the back of his head. That's the worst thing that's happened during the 5-6 years of operation. Aggression from inmates against staff are rare, and physical violence from inmates against staff are close to non-existing. And recidivism in the Nordic countries are low. It's hard to compare between different countries because the way recidivism is kind of calculated varies among the countries. You can't really directly compare, but still the recidivism is very, very low. Now, what is caused by? A humane treatment, the facilities in Halden, the level of activity, because we keep them in activity. School, cognitive programs, work. An inmate who has used his capabilities mentally or physically is much more calmer than one who's locked up 23 hours a day who builds up frustration and aggression, or a combination of them. I can't say, but I can just say that it gives results. Now one can say that, wow, we can't afford to build a Halden prison in my country. Okay, but I think some of what we do in Norway is kind of close to free of charge, so to speak. The concept of dynamic security that we believe very strongly in and that we think gives good results. It's a matter of decision making and some training and building a new culture. Doesn't cost much. So something can absolutely, we think, being transferred without a high cost. And one might say that, okay, that works in Norway, doesn't work in my country. Maybe that's true. But have in mind then that in Halden prison, we have at any given time between 35 to 37 different nationalities. That's because we're so close to the border, we have a lot of immigrants, etc. Open borders in Europe. And do we have more trouble with the inmates coming from the Eastern Europe, the south of Europe, the north of Africa? No, we do not. Do we have more violence among them than the native Norwegians? No, we do not. Why? I can't give the exact answer, but I strongly believe that treating people in a humane manner, that there is something universal about it. We have no more trouble with people coming from other places than Norway, just to have it mentioned. And again, recidivism, I think the rate now is a bit higher because at this point we put people in jail like drunk drivers. We don't anymore, and drunk drivers hardly have recidivism. So probably the figure is a little bit lower, but still it's low in all the Nordic countries. And I mean, if you're, I guess Halden prison is an expensive prison to operate from a US standard. But if you take the long-term perspective, what does the society save on the long term? If we can rehabilitate an inmate back to a normal life, what does that give the society back? Having a taxpayer back into society. So I think investing a little bit more in the yearly operational budget can give huge savings on a society level in the future. Okay, that was it. Thank you.